everybody, Max and Brian here for IGN. Now, everybody knows that the most lucrative possible thing you can do in Hollywood is create superheroes that then get turned into movies. But a recent Guardian article presupposes that maybe that's not the case. Brian, please elaborate.
Yeah, so we got some interesting news today from The Guardian, who wrote up this piece that basically said that a lot of sort of famous and, long-running comic book creators and artists and writers and stuff like that are actually getting very, very little money from Marvel and DC to see a lot of their characters and storylines hit the big screen. Sometimes as little as low as $5,000 while these movies go on to make $1 billion or more. So obviously this is a gigantic problem. This is, part of a kind of the last 10, 15 years have really seen a boom in comic book movies. They've become the most box office significant things on the planet, at least until the last year and a half, but they're still making money, and they are immensely popular, some of the highest grossing movies of all time, but they're actually the people who wrote for a lot of the original storylines that are getting adapted into these movies, and also Disney Plus TV shows, and this is across Marvel and DC, aren't really making a lot of money, and it's kind of stirring the pot a little bit because a lot of fans are actually starting to reach out to these creators being like, hey, did you see the show? Did you see this movie? And they're sort of hand-tied because they signed contracts ages ago when they were originally writing these stories specifically for the physical page before these things went on to become movies, and they're not really seeing much in return. So it's weird and it's gross, but it's also they're sort of stuck on these old contracts from the past, but I think things are starting to change.
Now, a lot of this comes by way of Ed Brubaker, who famously created The Winter Soldier, who's since, gotten a Captain America movie called The Winter Soldier, and then a Disney Plus series called The Falcon and the Winter Soldier. So that's like pretty much become a household name, which is, I can see how, he might be a little bit salty. One of the funniest things is he said in a previous interview that he's actually made more money from Screen Actors Guild residuals for his cameo in The Winter Soldier than he has for actually creating the character, The Winter Soldier, which is just kind of mind-boggling. And I mean, at the end of the day, the thing is Disney has no obligation to pay creators for their characters.
Right.
Like that's kind of it. It's all old paperwork that they made with Marvel, and they signed over the rights. And it's, in a lot of cases, the writers get hired on to write a character that they didn't even create. Stan Lee created the X-Men, but Chris Claremont and Len Wein and all them helped popularize those characters and flesh them out. And they don't get full credits for that. But in this case, it's almost like a pittance. It's like a stipend to be like, hey, thanks for creating this thing that made us millions and millions of dollars and was very heavily publicized for doing so. Is a little bit, it's like they don't have to do that. It's kind of just. But it almost seems like an insult in that case.
Yeah, I totally agree. And then a lot of times they're not even consulted creatively in any way to watch some of their stories get adapted to the big screen. And that's such a bummer. Brubaker said, for the most part, all Steve and I got for creating the Winter Soldier and his storyline is a thanks here or there over the years. And that's become harder and harder to live with. He added, I have a great life as a writer. And much of it is because of Cap and the Winter Soldier bringing so many readers to my other work. But I also can't deny feeling a bit sick to my stomach sometimes when my inbox fills up with people wanting comments on the show.
That's got to be pretty rough. It's like, hey, I heard your ex got remarried. Did you go to the wedding? No, you didn't. Okay. But no, this is an interesting thing to talk about because obviously when a lot of writers and artists, sign on to work on superhero comics, if this was, 20, 15, 30 years ago, it hadn't quite become the money printing machine that it is since, that it now is.
Right.
I mean, there was even a pretty good stretch there kind of at the beginning of I guess this century, if we're going to call it that, where like superhero movies weren't really tested, and it was kind of like this, X-Men obviously blew the doors off of kind of big screen superhero stuff, but there were some flops here and there, and it wasn't always the kind of thing that you'd want to have your name on or you'd want to be associated with. But going back even further, like really famously, for the longest time, Batman was accredited to Bob Kane, even though it was created by Bob Kane and Bill Finger. And there's a whole, I think there's a whole documentary about that. And that's got to be really rough because they created him back in in the 30s. That's going back a very long time. But again, if you're kids or grandkids of somebody who created a character like that, and you're just like, oh, there's my legacy, making just millions and billions of dollars, and yeah, it's tricky, you know. It's
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is that a lot of these original contracts were designed around sort of keeping writers and artists locked in for as long as possible by kind of incentivizing them with like points back or royalties based on how long a run went. So if you were like writing or illustrating for a comic and it went for like 2 years or something like that, you know, and they wanted to keep pushing you to keep going, you'd get a little bit more money on the back end from that. But those things weren't shaped to scale to these modern big budget movies that they are now. And so like you want to sympathize with these artists, and also it's like, you know, Disney and DC have the money because they're some of the most lucrative things in the world. Now, obviously, this is not every single person. Jim Starlin, who created Thanos, basically said the squeaky wheel gets the grease. It seems like behind the scenes, kind of kicked and screamed a lot and got his way when Thanos became, I don't know, one of the most important villains, if not the most important villain in comic book movie history. I guess you can debate on whether that's Joker or not, but there's been various iterations of that. There's one Thanos for the most part. And he was able to get a little bit more money on the back end. And so that shows that there's a chance. But one of the things that this story cites is that this is harder and harder for some of the smaller names, some of the smaller creators. Some of the bigger people are getting a little bit of luck, sort of like shaking the money tree in and getting a little more money back from Marvel and DC. But the smaller people don't have that same sort of backing, that same power. So it's harder and harder for them to get any sort of recognition or financial kickback here.
Yeah, the funny thing is, this isn't really even the first time this conversation has happened. Even just within comics, this goes back a long ways, where there was a huge sort of not resurgence. There was kind of this renaissance of creator-owned comics. That's basically the foundation of Image Comics in the early 90s, was a bunch of creators banding together and being like, hey, we want to own our own characters. Like, we want to, like, you know, Todd McFarlane and Jim Lee and Neil Gaiman and all them. They were basically like, okay, we've written characters for Marvel and DC, and then they sell the comics and we don't really get anything for it. And then maybe they hire some other kid to come on and write the character and have them doing stuff that they would never have done. You know, it's this kind of, it's even in that case, I think it was just as much a creative ownership thing as it was like a financial thing. But the weird flip side of that is we've seen characters or creator owned properties become incredibly lucrative. Like, for instance, Mark Miller just recently cut a deal with Netflix for his entire Millerverse universe, and I think he made $31 million. And so far, all we've seen from that on the Netflix front was Jupiter's Legacy, which was subsequently canceled after one season.
Right.
But I don't think Mark Miller's too torn up about it because he got $31 million. And there's a new Kingsman movie, which he also wrote, coming out later this year. And then there's Robert Kirkman, who created The Walking Dead. He just I think he got poached by Amazon from his sort of partnership with AMC to go over to Amazon and develop new properties for 2 years. And we've seen Invincible, and it's so if you own your characters and you own that universe, obviously you can make a lot of money off of that. And I think that's something that people are striving for. But it's pretty hard to get your foot in the door in the comics industry without working with one of these two big publishers. And Mark Miller and Robert Kirkman have both done stuff with Marvel and DC over the years. So it's sort of this, I don't know, this kind of double-edged sword there. Mm-hmm. I mean, Frank Miller, famously salty about sort of, not just everything. How Hollywood handled his, everything. It's Frank Miller. Yeah, he'd be mad about, the RoboCop 2 wasn't his original vision, and then he hated Hollywood, and so he never went and did Hollywood stuff again. And then he went and wrote Sin City, and then Robert Rodriguez was like, "Hey, can I make this a new movie?" He's like, "I don't know, I hate Hollywood." And then he proceeded to make Sin City and probably made a whole bunch of money off of that. And then there's he owns that stuff, and at the same time, he also has seen his characters jerked around and had horrible things done to them. He infamously had a cameo in the 2003 abomination that was Daredevil, and he plays, rather poetically, the man who Bullseye stabs in the head with a pen, which is just like the most chef kiss of a little full circle thing. But again, that was from a period when it wasn't really this $1 billion plus monolithic industry, and like it's kind of hard to be like, oh yeah, Disney has the 7 of the most 10 profitable films in human history. Maybe not 7, but they, consistently are breaking their own records. It's got to be pretty rough to be somebody who created one of these characters and just sort of be like, can I have more than $5,000 of that billion. You know, it's
yeah,
it's a lot.
It's kind of FU money basically. And I think it's worth pointing out too that a lot of comic book creators in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, they came on to Marvel and DC to work on stuff based on pre-established characters that had been around there for decades, and it was probably a great break for them to be like, I get to write for Captain America, create new storylines, bring in new characters, bring back Bucky and all this other stuff. And subsequently, as the years went on, these companies got bigger and bigger, and then bigger and bigger, and then got owned by, DC's owned by AT&T, and connected to Warner Brothers, and you have Marvel is owned by Disney. These are gigantic companies with their hands in basically every pot. They're making money everywhere. They're making money off your cell phone bill and stuff like that. And so it got harder and harder for these people to sort of be like, hey, I own this little corner of this, or I own this little piece. Whereas some of the sort of more independent artists you named earlier, that's a sort of a 1 in a million chance to create your own, Millerverse or something like that, and get lucky enough that you can option those picture deals into bigger and bigger things. So it remains to be seen how this is going to shake out going forward. What's interesting right now is this conversation is happening sort of simultaneously with recently Marvel announcing that they're done with sort of big picture deals or multi-picture deals for actors. So you won't see that kind of tried and true, Robert Downey Jr. signing on for 5 movies or something for, X billion dollars. And we've also got the lawsuit recently with Scarlett Johansson suing Disney for the sort of kickback royalties on Disney Plus streaming revenue. And so it seems like this is a giant multi-billion-dollar factory, but people individually are starting to come for the money that's involved in it. And I think this is going to have some very serious ramifications and really change things.
Yeah, I mean, conversely, if you're an up-and-coming comics creator, and you see these sort of two things side by side where, the guy who created Thanos had to kick and scream to get paid more than $5,000 in a movie ticket for creating that character, or, Mark Miller has a bunch of wacky ideas that are vaguely kick-ass flavored, and he makes $31 million off of that. It wouldn't surprise me if we saw more smaller comics labels pop up, or more creator-owned stuff kind of, rear its head. And obviously, nothing's going to stop Marvel and DC. They're going strong. They're doing just fine. But as far as it seems like they're definitely leaning more heavily on their sort of backlog and their well of existing stuff than thinking too far ahead about maybe scaring off a future of creatives.
Yep. I mean, and I think neither of these companies are really willing to talk about these contracts in any way, and they want to keep that shielded from the audience, and they want you to kind of keep going to see these movies. But I do hope that they find some sort of deal here to make things worth it for the creators of the past and present and future, because comic book movies aren't going away, and neither are the people who created some of the characters and will continue to write for these stories.
Yeah. In the meantime, if you want to check out a comic book creator and a comic book movie, John Ostrander, the creator of Suicide Squad, is the 3rd person to show up on screen in that movie, and he got credits in the credits for that. So that's cool. Let us know in the comments what you think of this whole scenario, this whole situation. Where do you fall on this? And if you're gonna pitch superhero ideas, don't do it in there, because someone's gonna rip you off, and then you'll have to live in a van down by the river while your YouTube comment. I don't know what we're saying. We're spinning our wheels. But thank you for watching. Let us know what you think. And for everything superheroes, movies, and the big, huge, whirling maelstrom of them colliding, keep it right here on IGN. Pow!